A man died in 1856, and philosophy forgot him almost immediately. No eulogies in the newspapers, no mourners at the funeral, except two old friends. His book had been out of print for years. His ideas, which had once sparked furious debate across Germany, had vanished like smoke. This was Max Stirner, and here's what makes his story strange. The book he wrote would later be called one of the most dangerous ever published, influencing everyone, from anarchists to existentialists to Nietzsche himself. But when he died at 49 from an infected insect bite, alone and broke in Berlin, nobody cared. How does someone go from philosophical provocateur to complete obscurity in just 12 years? And why did it take decades for anyone to even try reconstructing his life? The man we know as Max Stirner wasn't born with that name. Johann Caspar Schmidt entered the world on October 25th, 1806, in Bayreuth, Bavaria. His parents were Lutherans, middle class, unremarkable. His father, Albert Christian Heinrich Schmidt, worked as a wind instrument maker. His mother, Sophia Eleonora Rheinlein, came from a similar background. Nothing about this setup suggested the child would grow up to write a book, arguing that all morality is fiction and every social institution is a con job. But then something happened that would shape everything. 6 months after Johann was born, his father died of tuberculosis. He was 37. Think about that timing. Johann never knew his father. No memories, no relationship, no paternal authority figure to rebel against or model himself after. Just an absence. His mother remarried 2 years later to Heinrich Ballerstedt, a pharmacist, and the family moved to Kulm in West Prussia, now part of Poland. The boy who would become Stirner spent his early childhood in a reconstituted family, with a stepfather in a new place. We don't know much about these years. Stirner left almost no personal writings, no diaries, no letters that survived. What we know comes mostly from official records and the detective work of a biographer who wouldn't even be born until 8 years after Stirner's death. When Stirner was 13, something shifted again. He left his mother and stepfather in Kulm and returned to Bayreuth to live with an aunt. Why? The records don't say. Family tension, educational opportunity. We can only guess. But here's what we do know. This pattern of separation and displacement marked his entire childhood. Father dead, mother remarried, sent away to live with relatives. No stable family structure, no clear belonging. Whether this shaped his later philosophy, his radical rejection of all fixed identities and social bonds, is something scholars still argue about. But the pattern is hard to ignore. He attended school in Bayreuth, apparently performed adequately, and at age 20 enrolled at the University of Berlin. This was 1826, and Berlin was the intellectual centre of the German world. The university had been founded less than 20 years earlier, but had already assembled remarkable talent. And here's where Stirner's story starts getting interesting, because the philosopher teaching there, the one whose lectures Stirner attended, was Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Yes, that Hegel, the most influential German philosopher of the century, the man whose ideas dominated European thought, whose dialectical method would inspire Marx, whose system tried to explain literally everything. Stirner sat in Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of religion, the history of philosophy. He absorbed the method, the language, the framework. But he didn't stay in Berlin continuously. He transferred to the University of Erlangen for a period where he overlapped with another student who would become significant in German philosophy, Ludwig Feuerbach. Then he returned to Berlin, studying philosophy and theology. This back and forth between universities was common then, but it also suggests someone still searching, not quite settled. The records show he studied philology too, the analysis of language and texts. He was getting a thorough education in the dominant intellectual currents of German idealism, learning to think in the terms that every educated German used. Then his university career just stopped. Towards the end of his studies, Stirner started dealing with what records euphemistically call family affairs. What this actually meant was his mother's deteriorating mental health, In 1837, Sophia was committed to a mental institution. She would remain there until her death in 1860, outliving her son by 3 years. Stirner never completed a doctorate. He returned to Berlin, obtained a teaching certificate, and started looking for work. This is where the gap between aspiration and reality opened up. He wanted a full-time position as a teacher in the Prussian school system. Secure employment, decent salary, professional respectability. He didn't get it. From 1834 to 1835, he worked as an unpaid training teacher at the Königliche Realschule in Berlin. Unpaid. An internship essentially, with the promise that it would lead to a salaried position. Then he spent 2 more years, until 1837, trying unsuccessfully to secure that salaried job from the Prussian government. Think about what this means. He had the education, the certification, the experience, but he couldn't break through. Whether this was bad luck, poor connections, something about his personality, or the simple reality of too many qualified candidates chasing too few positions, we don't know. What we do know is that this failure to secure stable academic employment would define his entire life. He would never have financial security. He would never have institutional backing. He would always be on the margins, professionally and economically. While struggling with his career, he got married. On December 12, 1837, he married Agnes Bertz. She was 22, the daughter of his landlady. The marriage seems to have been based more on proximity and convenience than passion. According to Edgar Bauer, one of Stirner's friends from later intellectual circles, Stirner confessed something disturbing. He had once accidentally seen his wife naked, and after that, he couldn't bring himself to touch her again. Whether this story is true or just the kind of gossip that circulates in bohemian circles, we can't verify. What we know for certain is that the marriage was brief and tragic. Agnes became pregnant. In 1838, she died from complications during childbirth. The baby was stillborn. She was 22 years old. Stirner was 31, a widower, stuck in a teaching career that wasn't advancing, caring for a mother in a mental institution. Not exactly the life he might have imagined sitting in Hegel's lectures a decade earlier. But he kept working. He eventually secured a position at a private girls' school owned by Madame Gropius. This wasn't the prestigious academic appointment he'd wanted, but it was steady work. He taught history and literature, and by all accounts, he was good at it. Reliable, polite, competent. His students and colleagues remembered him as quiet, serious, professional. Nobody suspected that this mild-mannered schoolteacher was developing ideas that would explode like a bomb in German intellectual circles, because while he was teaching teenage girls during the day, he was doing something else at night. In 1841, he started attending meetings of a group called Die Freien, the Free Ones. This was a circle of young radical intellectuals who met regularly at Hippel's wine bar on Friedrichstrasse in Berlin, and the names in this group: Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Bruno Bauer, Arnold Ruger. These weren't random cranks meeting in a basement. These were some of the most important thinkers of the century, all in their 20s and 30s, all wrestling with Hegel's legacy, all trying to figure out what came next after the master's death in 1831. They called themselves Young Hegelians, and they were tearing apart everything their teacher had built. Stirner was there, but he was different. The others talked, they argued, debated, gave speeches, tried to dominate the conversation. Stirner listened. Witnesses remembered him as quiet, attentive, not contributing much to the verbal sparring. He'd sit there with his beer, his large forehead, his calm expression, just taking it all in. That forehead, by the way, is where his nickname came from. Stern means forehead in German, and at some point, someone started calling him Stirner, big forehead. It stuck. He preferred it to his birth name, and would eventually publish his major work under this nickname. Engels was there frequently, and decades later, he would recall that he and Stirner were great friends. Whether Marx and Stirner ever actually met face to face remains unclear. They were in the same circles, frequented the same bar, knew the same people, but no definitive evidence proves they had a direct conversation. What we do have is a sketch. Engels drew it 40 years later from memory, when a biographer asked him to recreate what Stirner looked like. It shows a man with that prominent forehead, a serious expression, nothing remarkable about his appearance. This sketch and one group drawing of Die Freien at Hippel's are likely the only first-hand images of Stirner that exist. While attending these meetings, Stirner met someone who would become his second wife. Marie Deinhardt was part of the radical intellectual scene associated with Die Freien, and she was unlike anyone from his previous conventional life. She smoked cigars, she played billiards, she drank Munich beer, she dressed in men's clothing to visit brothels, a shocking transgression of every social norm governing respectable women in 1840s Prussia. She represented everything the radical circle stood for: the rejection of bourgeois morality, the embrace of individual freedom, the refusal to accept society's rules about how one should live. They married in 1843, and the wedding perfectly captured the spirit of their circle. It took place at Stirner's apartment, and nobody had planned anything properly. The participants showed up in casual clothes. Nobody had remembered to buy wedding rings, so they used copper rings from Bruno Bauer's purse. They didn't own a Bible, so they had to scour the neighbourhood to find one. When Reverend Marot arrived, he found the groom and witnesses, Bruno Bauer and Ludwig Buhl, in their shirt sleeves, playing cards. The bride arrived late in her everyday street clothes. It was chaos, improvised, indifferent to tradition. Exactly what you'd expect from people who spent their evenings arguing that all social institutions were oppressive fictions. During this period, Stirner was also writing. In 1842, an essay of his was published in the Rheinische Zeitung, a newspaper that Marx was editing at the time. The piece was called "The False Principle of Our Education," and it attacked both the classical humanist approach to education and the practical realist alternative. Stirner argued that education shouldn't be about filling students with knowledge or training them for useful work. Both approaches missed the point. Instead, education should help people become free natures, autonomous individuals who understand themselves. He called this approach personalist, and it was a preview of arguments he would develop much more fully in his major work. Because while teaching at Madame Gropius's school, while attending Die Freien meetings, while navigating his marriage to Marie, Stirner was working on a book. He was taking all those years of studying Hegel, all those nights listening to radical arguments at Hippel's, all that frustration with his failed career and economic precarity, and channeling it into the most extreme critique of society anyone had written. The book would be called Der Einzige und sein Eigentum, the unique one and his property, though it's often translated as the ego and its own. And when it appeared in October 1844, dated 1845, for the next year, it detonated in German intellectual circles like nothing before it. The book's core argument was simple and devastating. Everything you think is important, everything society tells you to value, everything that claims authority over you is empty. Religion, empty concept. The state, fiction. Morality, made-up rules. Liberalism, socialism, humanism, all the fashionable progressive ideologies. Just new versions of the same old con, trying to subordinate you to some abstract ideal. Stirner argued that the only reality is the individual ego, the unique one, which exists before and beyond all concepts. You owe nothing to anyone. No duties, no obligations, no higher purposes. All things are nothing to me. That was his position, stated baldly, without apology or qualification. He dedicated the book to "My sweetheart, Marie Deinhardt." It was a gesture of romantic devotion, but the irony is hard to miss, because what happened next would test whether his philosophy could survive contact with reality. Marie had money from an inheritance. Stirner convinced her to invest it in a business venture. Not just any business. He wanted to open a dairy shop, a cooperative enterprise where he and some fellow young Hegelians would handle milk distribution from farmers into the city. The philosopher of radical egoism was going into the milk business with his wife's money. What could go wrong? Everything. The dairy shop was a disaster from day one. Stirner had the theory down perfectly. He'd secured suppliers, these German dairy farmers willing to deliver fresh milk into Berlin. He'd set up the distribution logistics. He'd even made sure the shop itself looked impressive, well decorated, professional. The young Hegelian intellectuals who'd signed on as partners showed up in their nice clothes, ready to revolutionize the dairy industry through cooperative principles. There was just one tiny problem. Nobody wanted to buy milk from them. The farmers were suspicious immediately. These weren't fellow working men. These were city intellectuals in fancy coats talking about philosophical principles while handling their product. The farmers didn't trust them, and that tension poisoned the supply relationships from the start. But the real issue was customers, or rather, the complete absence of customers. Stirner had made a fundamental error. He'd focused entirely on supply without securing demand. He had milk flowing in from the countryside, but no actual list of buyers. He'd assumed that if you opened a well-stocked dairy shop in Berlin, customers would simply appear. They didn't. The shop was too nice. That sounds absurd, but it's what happened. Stirner and his partners had decorated the place so elaborately that ordinary Berliners felt uncomfortable walking in. They were poor. Their clothes were shabby. This dairy shop looked like it belonged to aristocrats, not to people buying their daily milk. So they went elsewhere, to grungier establishments where they felt they belonged. The milk came in. The milk spoiled. The money drained away. Within months, the entire venture collapsed. Marie's inheritance was gone. The cooperative experiment in dairy distribution had proven that even philosophers who rejected all social hierarchies couldn't figure out basic business operations. The failure drove a wedge straight through Stirner's marriage. This wasn't just lost money. This was Marie's money, her inheritance, gambled away on a scheme that anyone with practical experience could have told them was doomed. The man who'd written that all things are nothing to me had just demonstrated that he was spectacularly incompetent at managing the things that actually mattered. By 1847, Marie left him. She went to London, putting distance between herself and the wreckage of their relationship. Years later, when John Henry Mackay tracked her down while researching Stirner's biography, she was brutally honest about what she thought of her ex-husband. She called him a very sly man, whom she had neither respected nor loved, claiming their relationship had been more of a cohabitation than a marriage. That assessment is harsh, but there's something revealing in it. The man who preached radical autonomy and self-ownership had failed at basic human connection. The philosopher of egoism couldn't maintain a partnership, even with someone who shared his intellectual world. After Marie left, she didn't look back. She worked as a teacher in London under the protection of Lady Bunsen, the wife of the Prussian ambassador. Then in 1852 or 1853, she emigrated all the way to Melbourne, Australia, where she made her living as a washerwoman. Eventually, she returned to England and joined a Catholic commune. A Catholic commune. The woman who'd married the most anti-religious philosopher of the century ended up in a religious community. When Mackay found her there, she refused to talk about Stirner. The door was closed, the chapter finished. Meanwhile, back in Berlin, Stirner's book was creating the reaction he probably should have expected. It had detonated in German intellectual circles, and now everyone was scrambling to respond. Bruno Bauer wrote a defense of his own views against Stirner's critique. Ludwig Feuerbach did the same. Moses Hess published a response. Arnold Ruger jumped in. All these young Hegelians who'd sat around with Stirner at Hippel's, debating the future of German philosophy, suddenly found themselves under attack from the quiet guy who never said much during meetings. But the biggest response came from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They devoted enormous energy to attacking Stirner. In The German Ideology, a book they wrote in 1845 to 1846, though it wouldn't be published until 1932, Marx and Engels constructed a massive polemic against Stirner's philosophy. The number of pages they dedicated to demolishing him exceeded the total length of everything Stirner had ever written. They called him Sankt Max, Saint Max. The mockery was relentless, page after page of heavy-handed insult and ridicule. They compared him to Sancho Panza, the deluded sidekick from Don Quixote. As Isaiah Berlin later described it, Stirner is pursued through 500 pages of heavy-handed mockery and insult. Why did Marx care so much? Why devote that much energy to refuting a failed schoolteacher's philosophical tract? Because Stirner had struck a nerve. His critique of ideology, his insistence that all collective abstractions were just new forms of domination, cut directly at the foundations of what Marx was trying to build. Marx wanted to replace capitalism with communism, to create a society organized around collective ownership and solidarity. Stirner said that was just another religion, another attempt to subordinate the individual to some abstract ideal. Marx needed to destroy that argument. If Stirner was right, if all ideologies were equally empty, then Marx's entire project collapsed. The working class revolution, historical materialism, the inevitable triumph of communism, all of it became just another set of spooks haunting people's minds. So Marx attacked with everything he had. He tried to show that Stirner's philosophy was bourgeois individualism in disguise, that it served the interests of capitalism by undermining collective action. He mocked Stirner's style, his arguments, his examples. He tried to make the whole thing seem ridiculous. The irony is that this massive polemic became crucial to Marx's own development. Scholars now see the German ideology as the turning point where Marx moved from idealism to materialism, from focusing on consciousness to focusing on economic structures. Fighting with Stirner forced Marx to clarify his own thinking, to sharpen his analysis of how ideology actually works. Stirner probably never knew the full extent of Marx's obsession with refuting him. The German Ideology wasn't published in his lifetime. He would have seen some of the criticisms in other venues, but not the full 500 pages of mockery. What he did see was his moment passing, the brief period where people were talking about his book, where he was relevant to the intellectual debates. That faded quickly. By 1847, when Marie left, Stirner was already sliding into obscurity. His life became characterized by isolation and financial precariousness. He continued writing, but nothing he produced after The Ego and Its Own had the same impact. He translated economic works by Jean-Baptiste Say and Adam Smith into German, earning small fees for work that nobody remembers. He may have written some journalistic pieces for the Journal des Österreichischen Lloyd, though even that's uncertain. In 1852, he published something called History of Reaction in 2 volumes. It was mostly just excerpts from other authors, Edmund Burke, Auguste Comte, others, with occasional commentary from Stirner that wasn't always clearly distinguished from the quoted material. Commentators have generally found his later work to be of little independent interest. The fire was gone. And here's something strange about these years. The revolution of 1848 happened. Germany exploded in political upheaval, barricades in the streets, demands for constitutional reform, the whole established order shaking. This was exactly the kind of moment you'd expect a radical philosopher to engage with, to comment on, to use as evidence for his theories. Stirner seems to have largely ignored it. He remained curiously detached from contemporary events, living in his own private world of domestic routine and economic hardship. The man who'd written the most extreme critique of all social institutions apparently didn't find the actual collapse of those institutions worth his attention. Maybe he'd already said everything he had to say, or maybe the gap between his philosophy and his life had become too obvious to bridge. He'd preached total autonomy, complete freedom from all obligations, the primacy of the unique ego. But he was living in poverty, doing translation work to survive, imprisoned several times for debt. Yes, imprisoned for debt. The philosopher who'd declared that property was whatever the ego could take, and hold was locked up because he couldn't pay his bills. There's something almost tragic about that progression. From the radical certainty of the ego and its own, to the grinding reality of translation fees and debt prison. From writing, "All things are nothing to me," to discovering that things like rent and food and creditors very much matter whether you acknowledge them or not. By the 1850s, Stirner was essentially forgotten. His book was out of print. The intellectual world had moved on. The young Hegelians, who'd once debated at Hippel's, had scattered, pursuing their own projects, building their own systems. Marx was developing his economic theories. Feuerbach was still writing about religion. Bruno Bauer was doing whatever Bruno Bauer did. Stirner was translating economics texts and trying to avoid his creditors. In May 1856, something happened that would end it all. Stirner was bitten or stung on the neck by an insect. It seemed minor at first, the kind of thing that happens in a Berlin summer, but the bite became infected. He developed what contemporary accounts call a nervous fever. For a brief time, he seemed to recover. Then he relapsed. The infection spread, possibly becoming a tumour, though the medical records are unclear. What's certain is that on June 25, 1856, Max Stirner died. He was 49 years old. His death went largely unnoticed by the outside world. No newspapers ran obituaries. No philosophical journals marked his passing. The man who'd written one of the most radical books in German philosophy died in obscurity. His work forgotten, his influence apparently nil. Only two of the old young Hegelians showed up for his funeral at the Friedhof II der Sophiengemeinde Berlin. Bruno Bauer came, which makes sense given their long friendship. Ludwig Buhl, who'd been a witness at Stirner's chaotic wedding to Marie, also attended. That was it. Two people standing at a grave, marking the end of a life that had promised so much and delivered so little. At the time of his death, the ego and its own had been out of print for years. There was no indication that anyone would remember Stirner or that his work might have any lasting impact. He'd been a footnote, a brief controversy in the 1840s, quickly surpassed by more systematic thinkers. The story should have ended there, with those two mourners and an unmarked grave. A failed teacher, a failed businessman, a failed marriage, a forgotten book. But something unexpected was about to happen. Because ideas don't die when their authors do, and the most dangerous ideas have a way of surviving long after everyone thinks they've been safely buried. Decades passed. Stirner's grave went unvisited. His name appeared in no philosophical dictionaries. The bookshops of Berlin that had once displayed the ego in its own now stocked entirely different controversies. The intellectual currents that had seemed so urgent in the 1840s had been replaced by new debates, new systems, new certainties. Marx's Capital was reshaping how people thought about economics and history. Nietzsche was demolishing traditional morality from a completely different direction. The entire landscape of European thought had transformed, and Stirner had apparently left no mark on it whatsoever. But then, in 1887, something unexpected happened. A young Scottish-German writer named John Henry Mackay was living in London when he stumbled across a reference to a book called Der Einzige und sein Eigentum, The Unique and Its Property. The citation was brief, dismissive almost, but something about it caught his attention. He tracked down a copy, one of the few still in circulation, and started reading. What he found was a text unlike anything else he'd encountered. Here was a philosophy that didn't build systems or propose utopias or promise salvation through collective action. Here was someone who'd looked at every form of authority, every moral absolute, every sacred cause and said, "These are ghosts, phantoms that you've allowed to possess you, The state is a ghost, God is a ghost, humanity is a ghost, even the concept of man, with a capital M, that Feuerbach had elevated to replace God, was just another spectre haunting your consciousness. Mackay was 23 years old, already involved in anarchist circles, already questioning authority, but Stirner went further than any anarchist he'd read. This wasn't just about replacing bad institutions with good ones, or unjust hierarchies with just ones. This was about recognizing that every institution, every hierarchy, every moral claim was an attempt to subordinate the unique individual to some abstract ideal. He decided to find out everything he could about this forgotten philosopher. And what he discovered was that there was almost nothing to find. Stirner had left no archives, no collected papers, no correspondence that anyone had bothered to preserve. The man had simply vanished from intellectual history. So Mackay began detective work. He travelled to Berlin and started searching through records, tracking down anyone who might have known Stirner or heard stories about him. He visited the school where Stirner had taught, finding elderly teachers who vaguely remembered a quiet colleague from decades ago. He located the wine bar where Die Freien had met, though it had long since changed ownership and purpose. He even found Stirner's grave, neglected and overgrown. The search consumed him. For years, Mackay devoted himself to reconstructing Stirner's life from fragments, scraps, half-remembered anecdotes. He travelled across Europe, following leads. He corresponded with libraries and archives. He interviewed anyone who might have the smallest piece of information. In 1897, 41 years after Stirner's death, Mackay published his biography. It was the first comprehensive account of Stirner's life, and it did something crucial. It made Stirner visible again, not as a major figure, not yet, but as someone worth remembering, someone whose ideas deserved reconsideration. The biography appeared just as anarchist movements across Europe were looking for philosophical foundations that didn't rely on the collectivist assumptions of socialist thought. And here was Stirner offering exactly that. A radical individualism that made even the most extreme anarchists look moderate by comparison. Émile Armand in France read Stirner and found validation for his own rejection of all fixed moral systems. Renzo Novatore in Italy discovered a philosophy that matched his poetic rage against every form of constraint. In Spain, in Germany, in Russia, individual anarchists encountered the ego and its own and recognized something they'd been groping toward without quite being able to articulate. But Stirner's influence wasn't limited to anarchists. The book began circulating in other contexts, creating strange and unexpected resonances. Carl Schmitt, who had become one of the most important legal theorists of the 20th century and a deeply problematic figure who'd later align with the Nazis, read Stirner as a young man. The experience shaped his understanding of political sovereignty and the relationship between individual will and state authority, though he'd draw very different conclusions than Stirner had. Rudolf Steiner, before founding anthroposophy, encountered the ego and its own and wrestled with its implications. The young Steiner was drawn to Stirner's emphasis on individual development and self-realization, though he'd eventually embed these concepts within a mystical framework that Stirner would have rejected entirely. Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, once warned a small audience about the seducing power of Stirner's book. He never wrote about it publicly, never engaged with it in his published work. But that private warning suggests Stirner had gotten under his skin, raised questions that Husserl found dangerous enough to require explicit caution. Even people who rejected Stirner's conclusions found they couldn't quite shake off his questions. The art critic Herbert Read would later observe that the ego and its own had remained stuck in the gizzard of Western culture. Not digested, not expelled, just lodged there, creating a persistent discomfort. This is what happens when you attack the foundations rather than just rearranging the furniture. Most philosophy accepts certain premises, and builds from there. Stirner questioned the very idea of premises, the assumption that there are universal truths or values that should constrain the individual. Once you've read that argument, even if you reject it, you can't quite return to the innocent certainty you had before. But the most significant response to Stirner had been written decades earlier, and almost nobody knew about it. Remember that massive polemic Marx and Engels had devoted to Stirner in the German ideology, that 500 pages of mockery and refutation? It had never been published. The manuscript sat in an archive unknown to the philosophical world. In 1932, 76 years after Stirner's death, the German ideology finally appeared in print, and suddenly it became clear that Marx's intellectual development had been shaped by his encounter with Stirner far more than anyone had realized. The shift from the idealism of Marx's early work to the materialism of his mature theory. That transformation had occurred partly through his struggle to answer Stirner's challenge. Marx had needed to show that individual consciousness wasn't the foundation of reality, that material conditions and economic structures determined thought rather than the other way around. He'd needed to demonstrate that history wasn't just the story of unique egos pursuing their own interests, but of class struggle driven by material forces. The entire edifice of historical materialism was built partly in response to a book most people thought had been safely forgotten. This created a strange situation. Stirner had influenced one of the most important philosophical movements of the modern era, but the influence had been invisible, hidden in an unpublished manuscript. By the time people discovered it, Marx's system was already established, already being interpreted and applied by millions of followers who had no idea that it had been forged partly in combat with a radical egoist they'd never heard of. Meanwhile, the anarchist movements that had embraced Stirner were fragmenting and evolving. Some took his emphasis on individual autonomy in libertarian directions, rejecting all collective organization. Others tried to reconcile Stirner's egoism with social cooperation, arguing that individuals freely associating could create societies without sacrificing their uniqueness. Emma Goldman, one of the most prominent anarchist thinkers of the early 20th century, engaged deeply with Stirner's ideas. She saw in his work a necessary corrective to the tendency of revolutionary movements to sacrifice individuals to abstract causes. The revolution wasn't supposed to subordinate people to some future utopia. It was supposed to liberate them to become fully themselves, here and now. Federica Montseny, the Spanish anarchist leader, found in Stirner's thought a way to think about individual freedom that didn't depend on the bourgeois concept of rights or liberal notions of individual sovereignty. This was freedom understood more radically as the absolute rejection of all external authority over the self. But there was always tension, because Stirner's philosophy was fundamentally corrosive. It didn't build, it dissolved. Every attempt to create a system based on his thought ran into the same problem. The moment you establish any principle, any rule, any shared commitment, you've created exactly the kind of fixed idea that Stirner was attacking. You couldn't have a Stirnerite movement because movements require shared goals, and shared goals are abstractions that claim authority over individuals. You couldn't have Stirnerite ethics because ethics are systems of oughts, and Stirner rejected all oughts. You couldn't even have a community of Stirnerites because community implies obligations, and Stirner recognized no obligations except those the unique ego freely chooses in the moment. This made him simultaneously attractive and impossible. Attractive because he articulated something that people felt but couldn't express, that sense that all the causes and systems and moral demands were somehow false, somehow trying to get you to sacrifice yourself to something that didn't really exist. Impossible because once you actually tried to live by his philosophy, you found yourself in a void with no guidance, no principles, nothing except your own will and whatever you could take and hold. Some people found this exhilarating. The Italian individualist anarchist Renzo Novatore wrote poetry celebrating the criminal, the outcast, the one who stands alone against all society. He saw in Stirner permission to reject everything, to become a beautiful destroyer creating meaning through negation. Others found it terrifying. If there are no fixed values, if everything is just phantoms and ghosts, if the only reality is the unique individual who can't even be adequately described in language, then what prevents the strong from simply dominating the weak? What's the basis for solidarity, for cooperation, for caring about anyone except yourself? Stirner's answer was that those questions assume you need a basis, a foundation, a justification, but you don't. You cooperate when it serves your interest. You care about others when you want to. You create temporary alliances, unions of egoists that last exactly as long as they're mutually beneficial and not a moment longer. This wasn't social Darwinism. Stirner wasn't arguing that the strong should dominate the weak as some natural law. He was saying there are no natural laws, no should at all. What happens is what individuals do. If they choose to cooperate, they cooperate. If they choose to resist domination, they resist. But don't dress it up in moral language. Don't pretend you're serving justice or humanity or progress. You're serving yourself, and that's the only honest foundation for action. The political implications were genuinely radical. Not just anti-state but anti-politics in the usual sense, because politics assumes there are common goods, shared interests, collective goals. Stirner was saying those are all fictions. There are only individuals with their own interests, temporarily aligning or conflicting. This put him at odds with nearly every political movement of his time and ours. Conservatives want to preserve traditional institutions and values. Stirner says those are ghosts. Liberals want to protect individual rights through law. Stirner says rights are abstractions and law is just organised violence. Socialists want to reorganise society for the common good. Stirner says there is no common good, only individuals. Even most anarchists, who reject the state, still believe in some form of mutual aid, some ethical foundation for how people should relate. Stirner rejected that too, not because he opposed cooperation, but because he opposed the should. The moment you say people should cooperate, you've created a moral claim that stands above the individual, and every such claim is a form of domination. As the 20th century unfolded, Stirner's influence became harder to trace, but no less real. You can see echoes in existentialism's emphasis on radical freedom and individual choice. Though most existentialists retained an ethical dimension, Stirner would have rejected. You can see it in postmodern skepticism about grand narratives and universal truths. Though postmodernists often replace those with different theoretical frameworks that Stirner would have dismissed as new ghosts. You can even see traces in libertarian political theory, though most libertarians ground their philosophy in concepts like natural rights that Stirner explicitly attacked. The market fundamentalists who celebrate pure self-interest bear a superficial resemblance to Stirner's egoism, but they're usually defending capitalism as a system, and Stirner had no interest in defending any system. What remained consistent was the sense that Stirner had articulated something dangerous, something that couldn't be easily assimilated or domesticated. His book kept getting rediscovered by new generations who felt suffocated by the moral and political certainties of their time. And it kept creating the same reaction: fascination, followed by unease, followed by either embrace or violent rejection. Because ultimately, Stirner forces a question that most philosophy tries to avoid. What if there really is nothing beyond the individual? What if all the structures and systems and values we build are just elaborate ways of avoiding that terrifying freedom? What then? Most people, confronted with that question, step back. They reassert some foundation, some ground, some principle that rescues them from the void. God, humanity, reason, justice, something. Stirner wouldn't let you do that. He kept pulling away every foundation, showing it to be another phantom, another attempt to escape your own uniqueness. The result was a philosophy that couldn't be built into a system, couldn't ground a movement, couldn't provide answers, only questions. Relentless, corrosive questions that dissolved every certainty they touched. And those questions, it turned out, wouldn't stay buried. The book itself almost didn't survive. By 1847, 3 years after publication, The Ego and Its Own had stopped selling. The publisher's remaining inventory was seized by authorities and destroyed. Stirner's moment of visibility, already brief, was over, and he was about to discover that philosophical radicalism doesn't pay the rent. Marie Dainhart had come with an inheritance, not a fortune, but enough to matter. Stirner made a decision that's almost painful to read about. He would use his wife's money to start a business. The philosophical destroyer of all property rights was going to become a merchant, specifically a milk merchant. The plan seemed reasonable on paper. Berlin was growing. People needed milk. Stirner would act as a middleman, buying from dairy farmers outside the city and distributing to customers within it. Simple economics. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. Stirner had spent years thinking about abstract concepts, like spooks and the unique one. He'd written a book demolishing every social institution and moral principle, but he'd never thought about customer acquisition. He secured suppliers. Farmers were willing to provide milk. He set up the shop, decorated it nicely. Too nicely, actually. The space was so well appointed that working-class Berliners felt uncomfortable entering. They were too poorly dressed to buy milk in such elegant surroundings. And then there was the fundamental problem. Stirner had never bothered to line up customers before buying product. Milk arrived. It sat. It spoiled. Money evaporated. The whole enterprise collapsed within months. Marie's inheritance was gone. The philosophical attack on property had been funded by property, and now that property had been converted into worthless milk, nobody wanted to buy. The irony was thick enough to curdle. Marie left in 1846, moving to London. When Stirner's biographer tracked her down decades later, her assessment of her ex-husband was devastating. He was, she said, a very sly man, whom she had neither respected nor loved. Their relationship had been more cohabitation than marriage. She refused to discuss him further. She eventually emigrated to Australia, worked as a washerwoman, returned to England, and joined a Catholic commune. The woman who'd once smoked cigars and dressed in men's clothing to visit brothels with the Bohemian radicals ended her days in religious community. Stirner, the destroyer of religion, had lost his wife to God. By 1847, Stirner's life had narrowed to a point. No book sales, no wife, no money, no prospects. He was 39 years old and had accomplished one thing, writing a book almost nobody read that alienated everyone who did. He continued to write, but the later work shows a man going through motions. He translated economic texts by Adam Smith and Jean-Baptiste Say into German, purely for money. The philosopher who'd rejected all systems was translating Defenses of Capitalism to survive. In 1852, he published The History of Reaction, a 2-volume work that's mostly excerpts from other writers, with occasional commentary. It's hard to tell where other authors end and Stirner begins, which is either clever meta-commentary on authorship or evidence he'd stopped caring. Probably both. He may have written journalistic pieces for various publications. May have. The evidence is unclear because he didn't sign them, or because nobody bothered to preserve them, or because they were so unremarkable nobody remembered they were his. For a man who'd claimed uniqueness as the ultimate value, he was becoming remarkably interchangeable. The isolation was profound. He remained in Berlin but detached from intellectual circles. The young Hegelians had scattered. Marx and Engels were in England, developing the theory that would reshape the world. Bruno Bauer was still in Germany, but had his own problems with authorities. The conversations at Hippel's wine bar were over. The moment had passed, and Stirner seemed curiously indifferent to the world around him. In 1848, revolution swept across Europe. Barricades went up in Berlin. Kings trembled. The established order shook. Stirner, the radical who'd attacked every institution, appears to have largely ignored it. No writings survive about the revolutions. No evidence he participated. He'd spent years arguing that political change was meaningless because all politics was based on spooks, and when actual political upheaval arrived, he stayed home. Was this consistency or defeat? Had he genuinely transcended political engagement, or had he just given up? The question matters because it gets at what his philosophy actually meant in practice. If you really believe all collective action is based on illusions, if you really think revolution just replaces old ghosts with new ones, then abstaining makes sense. But it also makes you irrelevant. Debt became the dominant fact of his existence. He was imprisoned twice for failing to pay creditors. Not long imprisonments, but humiliating ones. The man who'd declared property a spook was being locked up for not respecting property claims. He borrowed from friends, paid late, borrowed more. The paper trail shows a life of constant scrambling, of never having quite enough. His health began failing. The specifics are unclear because he didn't write about it and nobody else was paying attention. What we know is that in May 1856, at age 49, Stirner developed what was described as a nervous fever. 2 people attended the funeral who'd been a witness at Stirner's chaotic wedding to Marie. 2 men representing a movement that had disbanded, a circle that had dissolved, a moment that had ended. The man who'd written the most radical individualist philosophy of the 19th century was buried by a committee of 2. The death went unnoticed. No obituaries in major papers. No philosophical journals marking the passing of a significant thinker. The Ego and its Own had been out of print for years. The few copies that existed were gathering dust in libraries and private collections. Stirner had lived just long enough to see his work completely forgotten. His mother outlived him by 3 years. She'd been committed to a mental institution in 1837 and remained there until her death. Stirner had spent his university years dealing with her deteriorating mental health, had lived with the knowledge of her confinement, and had written a philosophy that rejected all external obligations, including family duty. Whether her condition influenced his thinking is speculation, but a man whose mother spent 20 years in an asylum while he developed a theory of absolute individual autonomy is at minimum an interesting biographical fact. What happened next is where the story gets strange, because for 40 years, nothing happened. Stirner remained buried in obscurity. The intellectual currents of the late 19th century flowed around his grave without disturbing it. Then in 1897, a Scottish-German writer named John Henry Mackay published a biography. Mackay had discovered Stirner's work by accident during a stay in London. The Ego and its Own had been translated into English in 1907, but earlier German editions were still findable if you knew where to look. Mackay read it and became obsessed, not just with the philosophy, but with the man. Who was this Stirner? What had happened to him? The research took years. Mackay tracked down surviving acquaintances, now elderly and scattered. He searched archives in Berlin, visited the neighbourhoods where Stirner had lived, examined records. He found Marie in England in her Catholic commune, and she refused to speak about her ex-husband. He pieced together the fragments of a life that had left almost no trace. The biography appeared in 1897 with a second edition in 1910 and a definitive third in 1914. It rescued Stirner from complete oblivion. But rescue came with complications, because Mackay wasn't just documenting a life, he was constructing one. With so few facts available, biography shaded into interpretation, interpretation into invention. How much of what we know about Stirner is Mackay's creation, rather than historical recovery? We'll never know for certain. The sources Mackay used have mostly disappeared. We can't check his work against primary documents because those documents don't exist or weren't preserved or were destroyed. What we have is Mackay's account, and we have to trust it or reject it or live with uncertainty. But here's what the biography did accomplish. It made Stirner available again. Not just his ideas, but his existence as a historical figure. And once available, he began to influence new generations. The anarchist movement discovered him. Individualist anarchists particularly seized on his work as providing philosophical grounding for their rejection of all authority. Émile Armand in France, Renzo Novatore in Italy, Benjamin Tucker in America, they all read Stirner and found ammunition for their own projects. Emma Goldman, the anarcha-feminist, read him and was both attracted and repelled. The attraction was obvious. Here was someone who rejected all external authority, all moral claims that stood above the individual. The repulsion came from the implications. If you take Stirner seriously, how do you build solidarity? How do you create movements? How do you fight oppression collectively when the collective itself is a spook? These questions weren't just theoretical. They were practical problems for anyone trying to actually use Stirner's philosophy, because the book tears down everything but builds nothing. It's entirely negative in its method. Every attempt to construct a positive program, to say what should replace the institutions being destroyed, immediately creates a new ghost, a new fixed idea standing over the individual. Some readers embraced this as liberation, others saw it as paralysis. And Stirner, dead for decades, couldn't clarify or defend or explain. The text stood alone, ambiguous and corrosive, doing its work without its author's guidance. The early 20th century brought new readers with different concerns. Existentialists found anticipations of their own emphasis on radical freedom and individual choice. But most existentialists, even the atheists, retained some ethical framework. Sartre talked about authenticity and responsibility. Camus talked about rebellion and solidarity. Stirner would have called these spooks. Psychoanalytic theory borrowed the language of egoism without the philosophy. Freud's concept of the ego wasn't Stirner's unique one, but the terminology created associations. People read Stirner through Freudian lenses or read Freud through Stirnerian ones, creating hybrid interpretations that would have baffled both men. Postmodernism's skepticism about grand narratives and universal truths echoed Stirner's attack on fixed ideas. But postmodernists often replace those narratives with theoretical frameworks of their own. Deconstruction, discourse analysis, genealogy. These became new methods, new approaches, arguably new spooks. Stirner had refused any method at all beyond the assertion of his own uniqueness. What this history reveals is that Stirner's philosophy is almost impossible to use. You can be inspired by it, you can borrow from it, you can cite it in support of your own positions, but you can't build on it because building requires foundations, and Stirner demolished all foundations, including his own. This creates a paradox for anyone trying to actually live according to Stirner's principles. The moment you try to systematize his thought, you've betrayed it. The moment you create a political movement based on egoism, you've created another fixed idea standing over the individual. The moment you say, "We egoists believe," you've stopped being an egoist. Some tried anyway. Benjamin Tucker in America attempted to build an individualist anarchist politics from Stirnerian foundations. He published Stirner's work in English, promoted it through his journal Liberty, and tried to create a coherent philosophy of individual sovereignty. But Tucker had to add things Stirner never said. He had to construct a theory of property rights, of voluntary association, of how conflicts would be resolved. He built a structure where Stirner had left ruins. The result was coherent, but no longer purely Stirnerian. Tucker's anarchism had principles, rules, a vision of how society should function. All of these would qualify as spooks by Stirner's own standards. Tucker was using Stirner as a starting point, not following him to the end. Others went different directions. Dora Marsden, the British feminist, read Stirner and found in him a weapon against all forms of authority, including those wielded by the suffrage movement itself. She became increasingly radical, increasingly isolated, eventually abandoning political activism entirely for a kind of pure egoism that rejected all collective action. Her magazine, The Free Woman, moved from feminist politics to philosophical individualism, so extreme that most of her former allies couldn't follow. This is what happens when you take Stirner seriously. You end up alone, because solidarity, movement, collective action, all of these require subordinating your unique individuality to something larger. They require accepting some common purpose, some shared identity, some ghost that stands over all the individuals involved. Stirner saw this clearly. He wasn't trying to build a movement. He was explaining why movements can't liberate you, why every revolution creates new masters, why every emancipation turns into a new form of bondage. The book is diagnostic, not prescriptive. It identifies the disease but offers no cure because the cure would itself be a disease. What about the man himself? During all this posthumous influence, we left him in 1847, abandoned by his second wife. His business failed, his brief moment of notoriety ending. The last 9 years of Stirner's life were characterized by isolation and poverty. He continued to write, but nothing that matched the impact of his one major work. In 1852, he published History of Reaction, a 2-volume work that mostly consisted of excerpts from other thinkers. Burke, Comte, various conservatives and reactionaries. Stirner added commentary, but the work is more compilation than original contribution. It's unclear what he was trying to accomplish. The book sold poorly and is rarely read today, even by Stirner scholars. He made money through translation work, rendering the economic writings of Adam Smith and John Baptiste Say into German. Competent work, professional, entirely forgettable. The man who had written one of the most radical books of the century was now translating economics treatises for publishers who probably had no idea who he was. Money was a constant problem. He was imprisoned twice for debt, once in 1853 and again in 1854. The details are sparse. We know he owed money, couldn't pay, was jailed until the debts were settled or forgiven. The philosopher of absolute freedom locked in a cell because of economic obligations. The irony is sharp enough to draw blood. During these years, he lived alone in various Berlin apartments, moving frequently as financial circumstances required. He had no students, no followers, no circle of admirers. The young Hegelians had scattered. Marx was in London, Engels in Manchester, both working on their own projects. The revolution of 1848 had come and gone, failing across Europe. Stirner seems to have ignored it entirely, or if he noticed, he left no record of his thoughts. This detachment is striking. 1848 was the biggest political event of the era. Revolutions erupted in France, Germany, Austria, Italy. Barricades went up in Berlin itself, and Stirner, the radical who had written the most extreme political philosophy of the age, apparently didn't care. Or maybe he cared, but saw no point in participating. What would a revolution accomplish except replacing one set of spooks with another? He was sick frequently during these final years. The exact nature of his illnesses isn't recorded. Poverty and poor living conditions took their toll, and that's where he would have remained except for John Henry Mackay's obsessive biographical work 40 years later. Without Mackay, we'd have almost nothing. A few documents, some mentions in other people's letters, the book itself. The person who wrote it would be a ghost more insubstantial than the ones he'd tried to exorcise. This raises uncomfortable questions about historical knowledge. How many other figures have vanished completely because no one bothered to preserve their stories? How much of what we think we know about the past is shaped by which biographers got interested in which subjects? History isn't a record of what happened. It's a record of what someone cared enough to write down, and what survived long enough for someone else to find interesting. Stirner's later years also complicate his philosophy in ways that make some readers uncomfortable. Here's a man who wrote the most uncompromising defense of individual autonomy, who insisted that nothing should stand above the unique one, who rejected all external constraints. And he spent his final decade trapped by economic necessity, imprisoned by debt. Does this invalidate the philosophy? Some would say yes. If Stirner's ideas couldn't help Stirner himself live a free life, what good are they? The philosophy promised liberation, but delivered nothing except isolation and failure. But you could read it differently. Maybe Stirner's poverty and failure demonstrate the cost of actually living according to his principles. Society punishes those who refuse to play by its rules. The unique one who rejects all spooks ends up with no community, no support, no safety net. Freedom has a price, and Stirner paid it. Or maybe the connection between the philosophy and the life is less direct than we assume. Writers produce ideas that exceed their own capacity to live by them. The work exists independently of the person who created it. Stirner's inability to escape poverty doesn't necessarily say anything about whether his ideas are true or useful or important. What we can say is that his life and his philosophy were both marked by the same pattern: radical negation followed by nothing. He tore down every structure, every belief, every source of meaning that society offered, and then he offered nothing to replace them except the bare assertion of his own uniqueness. His life followed a similar trajectory: brief engagement with intellectual culture, followed by decades of isolation and withdrawal. The 20th century would discover Stirner repeatedly, each time through a different lens. The anarchists saw him as providing philosophical grounding for their politics, though they had to ignore the parts where he rejected all politics. The existentialists saw anticipations of their own emphasis on radical freedom, though Stirner lacked their ethical concerns. The postmodernists appreciated his skepticism about universal truths, though they built theoretical frameworks he would have rejected. Each appropriation was partial, selective, arguably unfaithful to the text. But that might be the only way to use Stirner. Take what you need, ignore the rest, don't worry about consistency. He'd probably approve. After all, he insisted that the unique one has no obligation to any idea, including his own ideas. The strangest legacy is how Stirner influenced people who explicitly rejected him. Marx's materialism developed partly in response to Stirner's critique. The hundreds of pages Marx devoted to attacking Stirner in the German ideology show someone working through fundamental questions about what grounds political action, what justifies collective struggle, how to think about human nature and social change. Marx emerged from that confrontation with a framework that could answer Stirner's challenges: historical materialism, class consciousness, the dialectic. These provided ways to think about collective action and social transformation that didn't rely on the spooks Stirner had demolished. Whether Marx actually succeeded in escaping Stirner's critique is debatable, but the attempt shaped his mature thought. So Stirner's influence worked through negation. He didn't provide a positive program that others could follow. He posed questions that forced others to develop answers he would have rejected. He cleared ground that others built on in ways he never intended. His philosophy was a solvent that dissolved certainties, and what people did with the resulting uncertainty varied wildly. This makes him different from most influential philosophers. Usually we can trace a lineage of followers, a school of thought, people who carried forward the project. With Stirner, there's no Stirnerian school because the philosophy prevents that kind of continuity. Everyone who uses Stirner has to betray him to make the ideas productive. The moment you systematize, you've created a spook. The moment you organize, you've submitted to something external. The moment you build, you've abandoned the pure negation that defines Stirner's approach. What remains then? A book that continues to disturb readers, to challenge comfortable assumptions, to ask questions that can't be easily answered. A life that demonstrates what happens when someone actually tries to live outside society's structures. And a name that surfaces periodically when people are searching for the most radical critique available, the most uncompromising rejection of all authority. Stirner's uniqueness, the thing that made him different from every other young Hegelian, was his refusal to replace what he destroyed. Everyone else tore down the old gods to install new ones. Feuerbach replaced theology with humanism. Marx replaced idealism with materialism. Bauer replaced orthodoxy with critical theory. Stirner just destroyed and then stopped, leaving nothing but the assertion of his own existence. That stopping point is where the philosophy becomes impossible to escape, but also impossible to use. You can't go further than Stirner because there's nowhere further to go. You've reached the limit of negation, the point where critique turns back on itself and devours its own foundations. But you also can't stay there, because staying requires maintaining a position, and positions are spooks. So that's the philosophical dilemma. But what about the man himself? What happened to Max Stirner after he wrote the book that would haunt philosophy for the next century and a half? The answer is almost embarrassingly mundane. The man who demolished all authority, who proclaimed himself the unique one beyond all concepts, spent his final years in exactly the kind of mediocrity and failure he'd theoretically transcended. It's like watching Nietzsche go mad or Schopenhauer obsessing over his poodles. The contrast between the philosophy and the life is jarring enough to make you wonder whether the ideas survive the collision with reality. In 1844, fresh from publishing The Ego and Its Own, Stirner had Marie Dainhart's inheritance, a substantial sum that could have funded years of writing, research, independence. What did he do with it? He opened a milk shop. Not as a statement, not as performance art, as an actual business venture. He genuinely believed he could distribute milk from dairy farmers into Berlin and turn a profit. The man who'd just finished arguing that all economic arrangements were spooks, that property was theft and ownership was illusion, decided to become a small businessman. The shop was beautifully decorated, too beautifully. Working-class Berliners who needed milk took one look at the refined interior and felt too shabby to enter. The intellectuals who might have appreciated the aesthetics didn't buy milk from shops. They had servants for that. Stirner had secured a massive supply of milk from farmers, but forgotten the minor detail of finding customers who'd actually buy it. The business collapsed within months. The inheritance evaporated. And Marie, who'd married this radical philosopher, expecting something other than financial ruin through spectacular incompetence, watched her money disappear into spoiled milk and unpaid debts. She left him in 1846, moved to London, later told Markay, Stirner's biographer, that he was a very sly man whom she had neither respected nor loved, that their relationship had been more of a cohabitation than a marriage. She eventually emigrated to Australia, worked as a washerwoman, joined a Catholic commune, and refused to discuss her ex-husband. The woman who'd smoked cigars and dressed in men's clothing to visit brothels, who'd embodied the bohemian spirit of Dyffryn, ended up in a religious community on the other side of the world, actively trying to forget the man who proclaimed himself unique. The man who'd written the most radical political philosophy of his era was curiously detached from actual political upheaval. He supported himself through translation work, German versions of Adam Smith's economic writings, Jean-Baptiste Say's treatises on political economy. He was imprisoned multiple times for debt. Not political imprisonment, which might have had some dignity. Debtor's prison, the mundane consequence of not paying what he owed. Each time he was released, the situation was no better. The translation work was irregular. The debts accumulated. Berlin society, which had briefly found him scandalous and interesting, forgot about him entirely. Picture this: a man who'd proclaimed that nothing was sacred, that all authority was illegitimate, that the unique one owed nothing to anyone, sitting in a cell because he couldn't pay his creditors. the self that owned nothing and was owned by nothing, trapped by the most ordinary social mechanism imaginable. Did he see the irony? We don't know. He left no record of his thoughts during these years. The ego and its own had been out of print for years. The few copies that existed were gathering dust in private libraries. Stirner's name, which had briefly been notorious in German intellectual circles, meant nothing to the next generation. It looked like complete oblivion, a failed life, a forgotten book, a philosophy that had burned bright and died without leaving embers. Mackay read The Ego and Its Own and became obsessed. This wasn't academic interest. This was conviction that something essential had been lost, that Stirner's philosophy contained truths that needed recovery. Mackay spent years tracking down every scrap of information about Stirner's life. He travelled to Berlin, searched through archives, interviewed anyone who'd known Stirner or knew someone who'd known him. He visited sites associated with Stirner's life, reconstructed the chronology, filled in gaps that seemed unbridgeable. The result was a biography published in German in 1898, with expanded editions in 1910 and 1914. Without Mackay's work, we'd know almost nothing about Stirner beyond the book. But here's what's strange about Mackay's project. He was trying to recover the man, but what survived was only the idea. The details Mackay uncovered, the milk shop failure, the debtor's prison, the lonely death, these make Stirner more human, but also more pathetic. The life doesn't validate the philosophy. If anything, it suggests that living according to Stirner's principles, or trying to, leads to isolation and ruin. Yet the book kept spreading. Through Mackay's efforts and others, The Ego and Its Own found new audiences. It was translated into multiple languages. Italian anarchists discovered it. American individualists embraced it. European rebels found in it a purer radicalism than Marxism or conventional anarchism could provide. By the early 20th century, Stirner had gone from forgotten to influential in ways he never achieved during his lifetime. Emma Goldman read Stirner, so did Victor Serge, Gustav Landauer, Renzo Novatore. The list of anarchists and radicals who encountered The Ego and Its Own and found it transformative keeps growing through the 20th century. Rudolf Steiner was affected by it in his youth. Carl Schmitt, the controversial German legal theorist, engaged with Stirner's ideas. Jürgen Habermas mentioned reading it. Even Edmund Husserl warned about its seducing power, though he never discussed it in his published work. These weren't people building on Stirner's philosophy. They were people being challenged by it, provoked by it, forced to think through problems they might otherwise have avoided. The book works like acid, dissolving comfortable assumptions. Whether readers ended up agreeing with Stirner or not mattered less than the fact that he'd shown them how far critique could go. The pattern repeated across the century. Each generation discovered Stirner anew, often thinking they were the first. The book had a way of feeling contemporary, regardless of when it was read. Stirner's attack on ideologies in 1844 spoke to people questioning communism in the 1950s, capitalism in the 1960s, identity politics in the 1990s. The targets changed, but the fundamental critique that all fixed ideas are spooks that possess us rather than tools we use remained disturbingly relevant. But did anyone actually live according to Stirner's philosophy? Could anyone? The evidence suggests no. Even the most radical individualist anarchists who claimed Stirner as inspiration ended up creating organizations, publishing journals, forming associations. The moment you gather with like-minded people, you've created a collective. The moment you articulate shared principles, you've established an ideology. The moment you act in concert, you've submitted individual will to group coordination. Stirner's philosophy works as demolition. It's devastatingly effective at showing why every moral claim, every political program, every social identity is ultimately arbitrary. But it offers nothing to replace what it destroys. The unique one, owning nothing and owned by nothing, consuming itself in its own transitory existence. This isn't a program for living. It's a description of a state that might be achievable for moments, but can't be sustained. Maybe that's the point. Maybe Stirner wasn't offering a way to live, but a limit case, a horizon that shows how far thought can go before it turns back on itself. The unique one is what remains after you've stripped away every concept, every role, every identity. But the moment you try to be that, you've created a new concept to inhabit. The moment you identify as the unique one, you're no longer unique. This is why Stirner's influence is so strange. He didn't found a school, he didn't create disciples, he didn't establish a tradition. People read him, feel the force of the critique, and then go off to do things that contradict his philosophy. They organize anarchist groups, they develop ethical theories, they build political movements, all things Stirner would have dismissed as spooks. But they do these things having passed through Stirner, having confronted the void he revealed, and choosing to act anyway. The life and the philosophy never reconciled. Stirner died in poverty and obscurity, having failed at the mundane tasks of supporting himself and maintaining relationships. The book survived and spread, influencing people who rejected its conclusions but couldn't ignore its questions. Neither outcome validates the other. We're left with a man who couldn't live his own philosophy, and a philosophy that remains impossible to live, but equally impossible to fully refute. The question that haunts every discussion of Stirner eventually surfaces. What are we supposed to do with this? If every ideal is a spook, every cause a phantom, every identity a cage, what remains except paralysis? The answer Stirner would give is simpler than you'd expect. Nothing. You're supposed to do nothing with it. The moment you turn his critique into a program, you've created exactly what he was destroying. A new fixed idea to worship, a new cause to serve, a new identity to inhabit. This is why Stirner's philosophy resists application. It's not a tool you pick up to accomplish something else. It's more like a fire that burns through everything, including itself. You can't use it because using implies purpose, and purpose implies a fixed standard outside yourself. The unique one doesn't use ideas. It consumes them, takes what nourishes, discards the rest, moves on. But humans don't work that way. We need frameworks, patterns, habits, the very structures Stirner attacked. Total freedom from all concepts isn't liberation. It's chaos, cognitive collapse, the inability to function. Even Stirner himself couldn't escape this. He had habits, preferences, routines. He taught school using curriculum he didn't design. He bought food with money, that ultimate abstraction. He used language, the supreme system of shared concepts. The gap between the philosophy and the life wasn't failure, it was inevitable. What Stirner described wasn't achievable, except in moments, flashes of recognition where you see through the construct before it reasserts itself. The rest of the time, you're back in the world of spooks, navigating by concepts you know are arbitrary but can't quite abandon. His later years demonstrated this with painful clarity. After Marie left in 1847, Stirner's life contracted into something barely recognizable as the existence of the man who'd written such a provocative book. He continued translating, work that paid poorly and offered no intellectual satisfaction. The translations were competent but mechanical, Adam Smith and Jean-Baptiste Say, rendered into German by someone who seemed to have lost interest in ideas altogether. He published The History of Reaction in 1852, 2 volumes that promised a sweeping analysis of conservative thought from Burke to Comte. What he delivered was mostly compilation, long excerpts from other writers with minimal commentary. Critics who bothered to review it noted the absence of Stirner's distinctive voice. The fire had gone out. Whether from exhaustion, poverty, isolation, or simply having said everything he had to say, the later work felt hollow. Debt pursued him constantly. He was imprisoned twice for failing to pay creditors, first in 1853 for several weeks, then again in 1854 for several months. The conditions weren't brutal by the standards of the time, but they were degrading. The man who'd written about owning nothing and being owned by nothing sat in a cell because he couldn't satisfy financial obligations to people he'd never met, under laws he'd never agreed to. Friends who'd known him during the Die Freien days barely recognised him when they encountered him on Berlin streets. He'd aged badly, his health declining, his prospects non-existent. The philosophical circles had moved on. New debates occupied the intellectuals. Stirner was a name from the past, occasionally mentioned but rarely read. In May 1856, something happened that the historical record can't quite clarify. Stirner developed what contemporaries described as a nervous fever. The likely cause was an infected insect bite on his neck, though accounts vary. What's certain is that he became seriously ill, experienced a brief remission that gave false hope, then declined rapidly. Marie was in Australia by then, having emigrated after working as a teacher in London. She'd later join a Catholic commune, a choice that would have amused and horrified Stirner in equal measure. His second wife, ending her days in exactly the kind of religious community his philosophy had eviscerated. The grave was in a Berlin cemetery that would later be destroyed during World War II. No monument marked the spot. No followers mourned. The man who'd attacked every form of collective identity died alone, unmemmoned by any movement, unclaimed by any tradition. You could read this as poetic justice, the ultimate individualist dying in isolation, his philosophy proven unlivable by his own inability to sustain relationships or basic material security. But that reading is too simple. Stirner's failure to live according to his own principles doesn't invalidate the principles. It just demonstrates what he already knew, that being the unique one isn't a sustainable state of existence. What happened next is stranger than the life itself. For 40 years, Stirner disappeared almost completely. The ego and its own went out of print. Libraries discarded it. The few copies that survived gathered dust. When the book was mentioned at all, it was as a historical curiosity, an extreme moment in the young Hegelian movement that had been superseded by Marx's more rigorous materialism. Then in 1888, a Scottish-born German writer named John Henry Mackay discovered the book during a year in London and became obsessed. Not with applying the philosophy, that would have contradicted everything Stirner wrote, but with recovering the man from historical oblivion. Mackay's detective work was extraordinary. He tracked down surviving acquaintances of Stirner, now elderly and scattered across Europe. He combed through Berlin archives, finding marriage certificates, teaching records, debt notices, every scrap of documentation about someone the world had forgotten. He visited the sites where Stirner had lived and worked, most of which had already been demolished or repurposed. The biography Mackay published in 1897 was the first comprehensive account of Stirner's life. The third edition in 1914 added more material, corrected errors, filled gaps. Mackay's obsession rescued Stirner from complete erasure, though it's worth noting the irony. Stirner, who'd attacked all forms of biography and historical consciousness as spooks that distract from present reality, was preserved for future generations by someone's obsessive biographical project. His influence spread through Europe and reached America, where Benjamin Tucker translated The Ego and Its Own and promoted it among radical circles. Emma Goldman read Stirner and found in him a critique of authority more total than anything in Proudhon or Bakunin. But the influence was always contaminated by the same paradox. People read Stirner, felt the force of his critique, then immediately started organising Stirnerite groups, publishing Stirnerite journals, developing Stirnerite political programmes. They created exactly the kind of fixed identities and collective movements he'd attacked. Some recognised the contradiction and didn't care. They used Stirner tactically, taking what served their purposes, discarding the rest. Others tried to square the circle, arguing that conscious egoism could serve as a basis for voluntary association without creating the oppressive structures Stirner condemned. These attempts always collapsed into the same problem. The moment you articulate principles for association, you've created an ideology. The moment you exclude people who violate those principles, you've established authority. The 20th century brought new readers who found different things in Stirner. Existentialists saw him as a precursor, someone who'd recognized the groundlessness of existence before Nietzsche made it famous. Post-structuralists appreciated his assault on fixed concepts and essential identities. Psychoanalysts noted his anticipation of the unconscious, his recognition that what we think we are is always constructed, always performed. Each appropriation distorted him in new ways. Stirner became whatever his readers needed him to be, which is probably what he'd have expected. The unique one leaves no disciples because it can't be imitated. You either recognize the void he's pointing to, or you don't. If you do, what you do with that recognition is entirely your business, and no business of his. The question of whether Stirner was right can't be answered, because it's not clear what right would mean. His critique of ideology is devastating, but so what? Showing that all our ideals rest on nothing doesn't make them disappear. We still act as if they matter. We still organize our lives around concepts we can't ultimately justify. Stirner showed us the abyss, but we still need bridges to cross it, even if we know the bridges are arbitrary constructions. What Stirner offers is a kind of corrosive clarity. After reading him, you can't quite believe your own beliefs the same way. The naivety is gone. You see the contingency, the constructedness, the arbitrariness of everything you've been treating as necessary and natural. That awareness doesn't tell you what to do, but it changes how you do whatever you do. Maybe that's enough. Not a program for living, but a permanent destabilization of programs. A voice whispering that whatever you think is ultimate, necessary, sacred is just another spook. You can keep it if it serves you, but don't mistake it for truth. The man died in poverty and isolation. The book survived and spread. Neither outcome proves anything about the philosophy itself. Stirner remains what he always was, a problem that won't resolve into anything comfortable or useful. You can't dismiss him without engaging with arguments that are genuinely challenging, but you can't accept him without abandoning the frameworks that make coherent thought and action possible. So he persists at the margins, read by each generation, found disturbing by each generation, never quite integrated into any tradition, never quite forgotten. The unique one who refused all categories, remembered primarily for his refusal to be remembered on anyone's terms but his own. That refusal is his legacy, if legacy isn't too grand a word for someone who spent his last years translating economics texts and dodging creditors. Because here's what actually happened after Stirner died. Nothing much, for a very long time. His mother outlived him by 3 years, still confined to the mental institution where she'd been since 1837. Whether she knew her son had died, whether anyone thought to inform her, the records don't say. The woman who'd raised him, remarried, watched him leave for university, then descended into madness that would keep her institutionalized for over 2 decades. She vanished from history without even the footnote her son received. Marie Darnhart, the second wife, who'd called him sly and unlovable, made a life as far from Stirner as geography allowed. Australia, then back to England, then into a Catholic community where she actively refused to discuss her past. When Mackay tracked her down decades later, she shut the door on questions about her ex-husband. Whatever she'd experienced in those years with Stirner, she wanted it buried. The young Hegelians scattered into their various fates. Marx spent decades in the British Library developing the theory that would reshape the world. Engels managed his father's factory and bankrolled Marx's research. Bruno Bauer descended into increasingly isolated reactionary positions. The conversations at Hippel's wine bar, those nights of radical argument and cheap beer, they became memories, then stories, then historical footnotes. Berlin itself kept growing, kept changing, kept forgetting the obscure teacher who'd once lived in its shabby apartments and died in one of its hospitals. The sites associated with Stirner's life were demolished or repurposed. The school where he taught became something else. The buildings where he'd lived were torn down for new construction. Even the cemetery where he was buried would eventually be destroyed in the Second World War. Physical erasure matched intellectual erasure. For 40 years after his death, Stirner might as well not have existed. Then Mackay's biography appeared and changed nothing immediately, but started a slow process of rediscovery. The book found readers who found something in it that spoke to their particular moment, their particular frustrations with whatever ideologies were currently dominant. This pattern repeated through the 20th century and into the 21st. Stirner surfaces whenever people feel suffocated by the demands of collective identity, whenever the gap between what movements promise and what they deliver becomes too obvious to ignore. He offers no solutions, which is exactly what certain readers need. Not another program, not another cause, just recognition that the programs and causes are always demanding more than they can justify. The anarchists who claimed him couldn't follow him all the way. They needed organization, needed shared principles, needed some basis for solidarity. They took from Stirner what served them and quietly abandoned the rest. The existentialists who saw him as a precursor were doing the same thing, using him as raw material for their own projects. Even the scholars who study him now, writing papers and books about his philosophy, they're creating exactly the kind of academic apparatus Stirner would have dismissed, making him respectable, institutional, safe, turning the unique one into a subject of study, a figure in a tradition, a name that appears in philosophy syllabi. But the book itself resists this domestication. You can't read the ego in its own carefully without feeling something shift. The ground becomes less solid. The certainties you brought to the text start looking more fragile. Whether you end up agreeing with Stirner doesn't matter as much as the fact that he's shown you how far critique can go, how little actually supports the structures we treat as necessary. That's what survives. Not a movement, not a school, not a tradition. Just a voice that won't stop asking uncomfortable questions. Why should you sacrifice yourself to this cause? What makes that identity anything more than a role you're performing? Who benefits when you accept these obligations as natural and inevitable? The life couldn't answer those questions any better than anyone else's life could. Stirner failed at business, failed at marriage, failed at basic financial stability. He died young, alone, forgotten. None of that validates or invalidates the philosophy. It just shows that having radical ideas about freedom doesn't exempt you from the ordinary difficulties of existence. What remains is a text that each generation rediscovers and finds disturbing for its own reasons. The specific targets change. In 1844, it was Christianity and humanism and the Prussian state. In 1900, it was organised labour and progressive reform. In 1968, it was revolutionary movements that were creating their own hierarchies. Now it's identity politics, social justice frameworks, the whole apparatus of contemporary moral discourse. The critique stays the same. These are spooks, phantoms that possess you rather than tools you use. The moment you let any abstraction stand above your own unique existence, you've submitted to domination, however voluntary it seems. You can reject this. Most people do. They have to. Living as if Stirner were right means abandoning the frameworks that make social life possible. No shared values, no common purposes, no obligations except the ones you create in the moment and dissolve when they no longer serve you. Or you can accept it partially, let it destabilize your certainties without destroying your ability to function. Read Stirner, feel the force of the argument, then go back to your life, knowing that what you're doing is arbitrary and constructed, but doing it anyway. That's probably what most readers end up with. Not conversion, not rejection, but a permanent discomfort that prevents naive commitment to any cause. You can still act, still participate, still care about things beyond yourself. But you can't quite forget that you're choosing to treat these things as important, that the importance isn't inherent. The man who wrote this was unremarkable in almost every way except his willingness to follow an argument to its most extreme conclusion. He wasn't a better person for it, didn't live a freer life, didn't escape the mundane constraints and failures that define most human existence. But he wrote a book that won't go away, won't be assimilated, won't be safely contained within any tradition, won't stop being a problem for people who want their politics or their philosophy to rest on something more solid than arbitrary choice. Max Stirner died on June 25th, 1856, having accomplished nothing except writing that book. No family mourned him, no movement claimed him. 2 old friends showed up for the funeral, and that was it. The unique one dissolved back into the nothingness he'd always insisted was the only reality. The spooks he'd tried to exorcise kept haunting the world without him. And the book, that strange corrosive text, kept circulating. Keep finding readers who didn't know they needed it until they encountered it. Kept asking questions that have no good answers, but won't stop being asked. That's what's left. Not a philosophy you can build on, not a program you can follow, not even a clear position you can adopt or reject. Just a voice that won't shut up, won't let you rest easy in your certainties, won't stop pointing out that everything you think is solid is actually vapor. The man is gone. The questions remain, and if Stirner was somehow aware of any of this, he'd probably find it grimly amusing that people are still talking about him, still trying to figure out what to do with ideas he insisted weren't meant to be used for anything at all.